Welcome. It is well that you have come. Whatever time of day, whatever location you receive this message in, I am so glad that we have the opportunity to connect in this way. And for those of you who have had the opportunity to visit the Temple Buddhist Center in person, you may be aware that directly across the street from it is a tall, fancy hotel. And a little while ago, a couple decades ago, I had the good fortune as a young college student, not even 20 years old, to work the front desk of that hotel. And I thought it was a pretty glamorous job at the time, to work in a tourist area of Kansas City, to meet people from all over the country and all over the world. And looking back on it, I now realize that I had another really good fortune at that job, which was to work for two amazing managers. And I've had a lot of work experience in that time: corporate, government, education, healthcare. So I have had a lot of different managers, and it really has helped me appreciate more than I knew how to at the time, these wonderful managers. And one of them was named Kenny. One night, Kenny and I were working. It was a quiet evening at the hotel, not very busy, and a guest came in, and I helped them, got them sorted out, got them their room keys, sent them on their way. And after they got out of earshot, Kenny very gently approached me and said something to the effect, obviously I can't quote the conversation verbatim, but I remember it, the feeling of it has very much stayed with me. He said, you're always so kind to people. You just, you're very smiling, happy, and that's great. But I don't think you realized what it sounded like to me when I heard you say, "I'm gonna stick you in this room." And of course, as soon as he said it out loud, I thought, no, I didn't know that I said that, and that sounds awful. Somebody's paying for an expensive hotel room at a fancy tourist destination, and the front desk person says, "I'm gonna stick you in this room." Like, well, we ain't got nothing else at the inn, so here you go. And I was really grateful to both the fact that he even told me this in the first place, because it was a huge aha moment. I mean, I knew, I had heard all the stuff about the power of language, but I really got it at that moment, that I had this capacity in choosing my words to have a real impact on my interactions with other people. And so I was grateful to him for that, but I was also, I didn't know at the time how skillfully he delivered what could have been kind of uncomfortable feedback, and it was a little uncomfortable. But that's not the main thing I remember now, all this time later. The main thing I remember is my gratitude that he told me, and that gave me an opportunity to grow. And that's why feedback matters. It is essential for us to grow. And we expect it in a lot of contexts, right? We expect our teachers to tell us when we're doing things well, so we can keep doing more of that, and when we're doing things that aren't working so well, so we can do better. And of course, feedback is essential for growth in any area of our life, but it's also essential and sometimes overlooked in the area of spiritual growth. But it is important because, number one, it helps keep us on the path. It's sort of like those rumble strips on the highway that let you know when you've kind of veered off and oh, wait, I need to get back in the lane. But if we're staying on the path, that feedback can also help us travel further and deeper into spiritual growth. The catch is that feedback is hard, especially when it comes to the more challenging stuff. the stuff that's about what we're not doing so well. And that's really what I want to talk about today, is how can we make friends with that process of both giving and receiving difficult feedback. Giving feedback is hard, but it's probably the easier of the two. But it's still hard. Why is that? Well, number one, most of us know that it's uncomfortable because we have felt it. And we don't want to make other people uncomfortable because we don't like to be uncomfortable. The other reason we're often afraid of making people uncomfortable is that we haven't learned how or been given the opportunity to learn how to deliver feedback skillfully. And so there's just a lot of doubt and uncertainty around it that makes us even more uncomfortable. So it's a catch-22. Then there's the act of receiving it. Even if we know to expect it, it can still be hard because feedback triggers some really deep, primal defenses around our essential needs as human beings. Our need to be loved, to be accepted, and to be part of a community. And those are all deep needs because they're tied back to our survival as humans, which has always been survival as a group, as a collective. And so for membership in that group, acceptance into that group to be threatened is a very deep existential issue. And even though getting feedback about how you're talking to a guest at a hotel, it may seem like a really far stretch. If we look deeply enough, we can potentially be getting into that deep stuff. And so that's why receiving difficult feedback can be really challenging, especially if we're not expecting it. But the good news is we can grow our skills to both give and receive feedback effectively. I want to start with talking about giving it because that is generally the easier thing to be able to do. And the easiest scenario to do that is when we do expect it. There's a mutual expectation of giving and receiving feedback, like in a classroom, like in sporting or athletic endeavors where you have a coach and you expect to get tips and pointers on how to do better. When I was in the education environment, I used to have to teach students how to give each other peer feedback on speeches and on writing. So I developed a little mnemonic device, a little formula to make skillful feedback easier. And it's very simple. I, suggest, and celebrate. Now the I is very important. It's the shortest word in that sentence, but perhaps the most important. And that is to use I statements like I think, or I feel, or I would have liked, or I really liked. Now, I statements get to a fundamental truth about feedback, which is that when we give feedback, we are not offering an ultimate truth about the reality of the world. We are giving our opinion. And it is just our perspective. At the end of the day, it is just our opinion. And so an I statement allows us to take ownership of that. But it also has this added value of creating a little space for the person receiving the feedback so that it's not so difficult to hear. So you can feel it in your body, the difference of if I say, you didn't do that well, versus I was confused by how that went, right? There's just a little bit of cushioning there that makes it a little bit easier to receive. So that's the I, and I suggest and received. The suggest, pretty celebrate and suggest. I think I gave the formula wrong. Can I get some feedback? It's I celebrate and suggest. Celebrate is what went well, right? We want to affirm, we want to give positive feedback because that lets us know what we should do more of. Like, keep doing that. Do it a lot. Build on that. And then the suggest. Where is the opportunity for growth, right? What could be improved? And that's the part that's usually difficult to hear. But if we build that skillfulness around it, of the I celebrate, then the suggest is usually easier to receive. Now that's sort of an ideal scenario. There is another scenario where giving feedback becomes a lot more challenging. And the analogy I like to give for this scenario is if we're driving down the highway and a car starts to swerve into our lane, and it's very apparent that they don't know they're doing it, and we need to honk. We need to let that driver know. And usually, in my experience, what happens is my heart starts racing, I get angry and afraid, I honk, and then that driver, they get startled, they become angry and afraid, their heart starts racing, maybe they overcorrect, they swerve, I've swerved. It's a little tense, but necessary, because the alternative may be a collision. The alternative may have a much worse impact. And so that feedback of honking at that driver is necessary. And in fact, we can consider it the more skillful way of handling the situation. So there are lots of potential ways to handle, and this is going to be a much more case-by-case scenario. It's not easy to just give a simple formula for this. But I am going to suggest a starting place that does provide a sort of formula. And this is something called nonviolent communication, or NVC for short. Lots of books, wonderful internet resources to learn about that. And it has a sort of formula that's more nuanced, more rich, more flexible than I can go into in this talk. But the basic idea is that we learn through nonviolent communication to identify and communicate our feelings, our needs around those feelings, and to make skillful requests based on those. But not only to communicate those for ourselves, but to really listen deeply and wholeheartedly when other people are expressing those to us. And so you can see how nonviolent communication, because it's getting at both sides, it opens up this discussion of how can we also receive feedback skillfully, which is the hardest part of this whole thing. And it's hard whether we expect to receive it or not. It's always challenging to receive difficult feedback, something that we're not doing well. But it's essential for growth, and we can see this because we know anyone who is at the top of their game, an athlete, a performer, a mathematician, they have and they seek out mentors, coaches, guides, because they know that in order to really be at the top of their game, they need someone to point out what they themselves cannot see so that they can continue to improve. But that means they themselves have had to build the skill of being able to receive that advice in what I call opening up, turning towards, instead of tightening and turning away from. So I'm going to suggest a beginning practice for how we might start to build that capacity to open up and turn towards difficult feedback. And it involves the RAIN practice, which you may have heard of. Tara Brock has brought this to us. Again, many wonderful internet resources, free guided meditations to practice this. But we can take that practice and combine it with another element. So the RAIN practice by itself stands for recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture. So those 4 steps, we can add another beginning step to apply those to as far as feedback. And what we can do is think of a time when we received some challenging feedback. not the most difficult time that we ever experience. We don't want to start with that. We want to start easy. So maybe a time when we just made a small mistake at work and maybe somebody pointed it out and we felt what Brené Brown sometimes calls the warm wash of shame. That idea that, oh, I am imperfect and that this reflects my imperfect nature and I'm embarrassed by that. So we can recall a time where we maybe didn't feel a major wave of that, but just a little bit. And as we recall that, we can do that in a safe, controlled environment, and we can apply that RAIN practice. We can recognize what's coming up in our mind, images, dialogue, what's coming up in our body, emotions. We can allow them to be there, maybe in a way that we couldn't at the actual time that we experienced because we didn't feel safe enough at the time. And as we allow those feelings, those images, those mental words to be there, we can investigate them and see what are the patterns, where are they occurring, what's the combination, how intense are they, do they change, is there something deeper behind them? And then as we've investigated, we may be able to see something that unlocks the nurture piece, which is realizing that all of that stuff that arose very likely arose in order to protect us, right? To keep us safe and from getting into what was perceived by some inner part of ourselves as a dangerous situation. And we can bring some compassion to that part of ourselves, to that experience. And the idea is that sort of like we go to the gym and train before we try and go out and climb Mount Everest, the more we practice applying this way of opening up and turning towards that difficult feedback, the more it becomes the automatic instead of the tightening up and turning away. So that eventually, in real time, when we get the difficult feedback, we will be able to respond in that more open way in real time. And instead of feedback then becoming a wall, it becomes a window into growth and spiritual connection with the person giving us feedback. The same way that I look back and I can feel deep gratitude and a sense of joy and care for Kenny all those years ago, who did such a small thing and yet has had such an impact on me. So yes, giving and receiving feedback is a challenge, but just the practice of learning to do it skillfully, that could be an entire spiritual path in and of itself. And the good news is it's a skill that we can grow and learn. And it's the surest path to growth. A key factor that we haven't talked about but that you may be already picking up on is that in order to do this, in order to get feedback and to give it, we have to have community. We have to have other people. And that's yet another reason why Sangha, spiritual community, is one of the 3 jewels that we celebrate every time we gather here at Temple Buddhist Center. Because through that connection, others enable us to see our rough edges and we enable them to see ours. And those rough edges begin to get polished in that way and reveal their luster and their brilliance. And this process of making friends with feedback involves getting to know ourselves in a deeper way. And in fact, making friends with ourselves. And when we do that, the veils are slowly pulled back and we begin to see more deeply our true nature, our Buddha nature. And when we can more deeply realize that in ourselves, we're more easily able to see it in others. And this type of clear seeing, this is vipassana. This is insight. This is clear seeing. This is the illumination, the realization of the Buddha nature that we all carry, each of us, within us.